Hi, welcome to Works. I forgot to shoot an intro for this video, so I'm just kind of going for it here. I'm building this epoxy desk, and I started with this large maple slab that I got from a local sawyer. And looking at this cool void, I wanted to include that. That was pretty much right in the center, so what I did was I shifted the center line by about 2 inches off of that. And then on the opposite side of the slab, I shifted the center line about 2 inches in the opposite direction, so that it was almost a diagonal cut across. Before I made any cuts, I cut out a picture of the slab and just cut up the paper piece just to get an idea of exactly how all the pieces would fit together. And once I was sure I was happy with that, I could get out my track saw and start cutting this slab up. Now, this piece of maple was about 2.5 inches thick, so I did this cut in 2 passes. I set it about half depth and then the full depth, and that still wasn't enough to get all the way through, so I used a Japanese saw to finish out the cut. I think I had about 1/4 of an inch that I had to cut by hand, and that worked just fine. Once that was cut apart, I could trim the ends, and I ended up cutting a little bit of a wedge out of one of the slabs just to narrow it up a little bit, otherwise the desk would have been too wide. With the slab still outside, I can start removing some of the bigger pieces of bark. I didn't go too crazy here. I just knew this was going to be messy, so I decided to keep doing this while I was outside. And I'm just using some cheap chisels here. The maple bark, I've used maple slabs in a couple projects. It never seems to come off very easily. So it's quite a bit of work to get it all out of there. So I start by just removing as many of the big chunks as I can, knocking some chisels in there. Sometimes you get a nice piece to come off like this. Came off in a lot of little pieces for the most part, and then I just took a hand plane and knocked the edges down. This way it would fit in the form. This slab was super flat when I first got it, but actually after cutting it in half, I ended up having a huge bow across the whole piece. You could see here it's probably out by a good 1/4 inch, if not more. So what I decided to do was use my joiner and start milling just the edges off where I could, and then I would mill the rest with a hand plane, this big joiner plane I have. Just taking big shavings and taking off what I could, and then I would go back to the joiner and take off as much as I could, and then clean up the rest of where the joiner couldn't get with my joiner plane. And I went back and forth a bunch of times, and I should have just gone right to a router sled here. I mean, it worked, but I wouldn't recommend doing it this way. And then here I was just careless and almost knocked the camera over, because I was just getting so fed up. This took hours just to join a little bit off and then hand plane it, and join a little bit off and hand plane it. Thankfully this maple was pretty soft, so hand planing wasn't too bad, but it was a lot of work. And this one spot where there was a branch in the slab, I took a jigsaw and just cut the edge off and just eased it over to give it a little bit more of a natural look. I didn't want a big flat spot where the epoxy was going to be, and I think that actually worked out really well. With the slab a little more prepared, I can go back and start taking the bark off 100% of the way. I use some wire wheels and little sanding discs and all that kind of stuff. This is a tedious process. This is probably the hardest part about making a river table or an epoxy table. This is the first epoxy table I ever made, and I severely underestimated the amount of time that this would take. This process especially, because you really have to do a good job here. You don't want any of this bark still in there. The epoxy might not adhere to that as well. And even though I was going for a pretty solid color with the epoxy, where you wouldn't really be able to see through the table too much, I still wanted to have those edges as clean and clear as possible in the event that there are parts that you could see through, and I wanted to make sure I got the best adhesion. Now, in my last big project, I had somebody ask about pricing, so I figured I would talk about the price of this desk. For this desk, I charged $5,000, which I think was a fair price, but if I were to do it again, I think I would charge more. I severely underestimated the amount of time this took cleaning up the edges and doing all that. I spent about $2,000 of materials, and I don't know exactly how much time I spent, but this whole project was over the course of a couple weeks, so you'll have to be the judge of my price when you see the final product at the end. With the edges cleaned up, I can move to a router sled. I decided that I wanted a perfectly flat surface all the way across the bottom because I didn't want to waste any epoxy in the form. And so I ended up just going to a router sled after doing all that work anyways, but I know that for next time that I should have just started with a router sled. This is a much faster process. And for a form, I went and got a full sheet of melamine, I started by cutting the full sheet down to the final size of the form, and then with the offcuts I cut those into 3-inch strips for the sidewalls. I used some caulk around all the edges and used a trim nailer. If I was going to do this again, I would use screws because that way you could take it apart and make another form for another project. The nails really kind of tear things up if you go to pull your form apart. I made sure to caulk all my seams too because I really didn't want any of the epoxy to leak. The epoxy is really expensive. It's around $100 a gallon. And then I went around and caulked all the corners on the inside too once the whole form was together. With the form done, I brought it into my storage shed and I actually put it on my picnic table because it was a nice sturdy base, somewhere that I could leave it for about a week. And I went around and made sure everything was nice and level. Everything has to be level because you don't want the epoxy to run into a corner or something like that. And then I used this mold release, which I sprayed quite a bit. This stuff was like $30 a can. It was crazy expensive, but it definitely saves the time from trying to peel all the melamine off the slab when it's done. And my slabs fit in there nicely. I also chamfered all the edges on my slab so it wouldn't damage the caulk on the corners and the bottom of the form. With the slabs in the form, I decided to clamp them down because I didn't want them to float once you put the epoxy in. That would be a real disaster. And finally, with the slabs in the form ready to go, I can start to mix up some epoxy. For this pour, I used Naked Fusion Deep Pour Epoxy, and I have to say their customer support was excellent. I had some questions and I called them up, and the representative there, she was super helpful. She talked to me for about 20 minutes and gave me some really good pointers. She said to mix all my pigments in the resin before I add the hardener so that I get my color exactly how I wanted it, and that was a great tip. So my customer here requested a blue table, so I started with this kind of aqua blue color, and it was way too bright, so I added some black pigment to darken it up a bit, which ended up working great.
Alright, here we go.
With my color made, I could mix in the hardener. I did this at 3-gallon increments because I only had one bucket that I was working with. I bought a brand new bucket for this so it was nice and clean. I didn't have to worry about anything there. And I can start by pouring that first 3 gallons in. I've heard some people say to pour on the wood so that you don't have bubbles, but there will be bubbles no matter what you do, which will rise to the top and will just get torched off anyway, so I don't really think that that matters too much. I didn't have any issues with bubbles inside the actual epoxy when I was all done. So I looked at that first color and that was still too bright. So for my next 3 gallons, I mixed in some more black. And that was a lot more of the color that I was going for, and I kind of swirled it around. So I did this whole thing in 2 major pours. With these 6 gallons poured, I let the table sit overnight. This was in the middle of summer. This was last July, and it was very hot, which is not ideal for pouring. So I left a fan on it overnight, and I poured it at night on purpose so that it would be as cool as possible. I'll just torch off those bubbles as they rise to the surface. The other thing I did off camera before I poured the epoxy was seal all the edges with a water-based poly. This was recommended to me by the rep at Naked Fusion. This keeps any bubbles from coming out of the slab as the epoxy cures. This is the next morning. The slab was pretty hard already. It was still tacky, but it was hard. So I needed to move on with the pour because if I let it sit too long, I would have had to go back and scuff sand the whole thing, which I didn't really want to do. I wanted it to blend into the previous pour. I started with another batch of 3 gallons. And with that 3 gallons poured, I decided to pour one more batch. For that last batch, I only mixed 1.5 gallons because it's all I think I needed. And I just poured that all the way out. That way, if there were any leaks or any other voids, they would just get filled in. With that all poured, I needed to let this sit for about a week before I wanted to touch it. So I can move on to making the drawer boxes and drawers that are going to go underneath this desk. For these, I just used some maple to match the desktop itself. And I can go through planing those all down. With my parts milled up, I can run them through the table saw to get a nice edge and then back through the jointer. I use a domino joiner here for alignment. And here I'm just making some panels that I can rip into drawer boxes later. I probably could have made these panels from plywood, which would have been a lot less labor, but I really prefer the look of solid wood, and I didn't want to have to edge bend the front of these, which you'll see will get beveled later. And with my panel made, I can go through and scrape the glue off. Before I started cutting the pieces out, I wanted to sand everything so it was nice and smooth. And that way the inside of the drawer boxes would be sanded once they were put together too. Squaring it up with a track saw, and then I can move over to the table saw. I wanted a bevel on the front, so I set the blade to 30 degrees. And then I can rip a groove for the back. The back I just used a piece of 1/2-inch plywood. You can see how that fits in there nicely. So with the pieces cut to their final dimensions, I can tilt the blade over to 45 degrees and run a long miter across each board. This way I get a nice waterfall edge that wraps all around the drawer box. It also gives me a nice grain match, and the one seam that's not grain matched will just go on the inside where you won't see it. I use a domino to hold these together because that makes things a lot easier with alignment here, although you don't need to do this. It certainly does make it easier, and I use epoxy for this glue up because it has such a longer open time. Wood glue would probably set up quick, especially because this was the dead of summer and it was in the middle of a heat wave, so I think it was about 90 degrees. And with my drawer boxes glued up, I can sand them out, which makes a big difference. They look so much nicer once they're sanded. And chisel the corners to clean up any of that excess glue or squeeze out. And sanding the faces, I used the pencil trick here just to make sure I could have everything sanded. With the drawer boxes made, I can move on to making the actual drawers. So I can mill up my parts here. I started at the jointer to flatten a face, and then I can square an edge and then head over to the table saw to make sure everything is nice and square. And then, since I wanted these to be 1/2-inch thick, rather than grinding that all off in the planer, I decided to just resaw them. I did this in a couple passes because my blade was not as sharp as it probably could have been. And then I could do the final pass with the planer to get these all into size. It's just easier to resaw that 1/4 inch off than plane it all down. With a lunchbox planer, it takes a while to do all that planing. And then I can go on to using a simple box joint jig to make box joints for the drawers and cut a groove for the bottom. I also made that out of 1/2-inch plywood. I really prefer to use 1/2-inch plywood for drawer bottoms. I think it's so much better than 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch drawer bottoms always sag. I've never had a 1/4 inch drawer bottom in anything that hasn't sagged, so I never make my drawer bottoms 1/4 inch. Everything glued up pretty nicely, and then I can sand it out. And for the fronts, I had these cool pieces of spalted maple. I thought that would tie in nicely with the top. So I took that piece of spalted maple with the most spalt in it, and I cut that out to roughly the size of the drawer front, a little bit bigger. And then I resawed that in half and ran the pieces through the planer. And with those veneers made, I can take a piece of solid clear maple and I can cut that down to size 2. And I only needed about a 1/2 inch of that, so I was able to resaw the same piece and sandwich 2 of those. And then I can glue those spalted veneers onto the front. I probably should have used epoxy for this as well, but I ended up just using PVA glue thinned out with a little bit of water. And I put some shrink wrap around it to keep it from moving and hopefully keep the pieces from sticking together, which they ended up sticking together. But that was okay. I was able to get them apart just using a chisel and a knife around the edge. It just took a little bit of working it to get the pieces to pop apart, but eventually they did. And with my drawer fronts apart, I can move on to fitting the drawers themselves. For these drawers, I used side mount drawer slides. I've since moved to undermounts, but for side mounts, I would make a little L bracket that I would sit at the bottom of the drawer, and this sits in there so that you can put the drawer slide against it and screw it in place. Pull this out. And then I can use that same little jig that will wrap around the bottom of the drawer and use that to screw in the sides of the side mount. So this quick little jig to make those work pretty easily. I've since switched to undermounts. I think they work a lot better, but those do work. And then I can trim the drawer fronts to their final dimension. And I left, I think, a 3/32 reveal on these. I wanted to keep them a little bit under an 1/8 inch because that would have probably looked a little big for a drawer this size. And I marked out the handles, or the holes for the handles. I screwed the drawer front in from those hole locations. because that drawer is inset. You wouldn't be able to get it out otherwise. And then I pulled it out and put some clamps on it, and then the other holes that I had pre-drilled on the inside, I could then put the screws in to hold the drawer front in place. Once those screws were in, I could remove the screws for the handles and later install the handles after finish. But it had been long enough, and I could finally move on to flattening the slab. It had been about a week later, and I didn't show a whole lot of this because it's just a lot of back and forth with the router sled. But this was a lot of work and made a heck of a lot of mess. So once that one side was done, I flipped it over and flattened the other one. And I was just trying to keep this as thick as possible. And I do think my final thickness was around 2 inches. And the router left some pretty rough marks, so I went to this really aggressive sandpaper that I had. I think this is actually for a flooring sander, but it fits my 6-inch sander. It's 24 grit. It's really, really aggressive. So I gave it a shot, and it was a little bit too aggressive. You could see it left some really bad swirl marks and stuff. So I ended up just going back to, I think I started with just 80 grit and moved up through the grits. And then I went around with my track saw and cut everything to its final dimension. There were a couple spots that needed some attention where there wasn't quite enough epoxy or there was a crack coming in from the side, so I cut out a couple little bow ties on the bandsaw, and for this I used mahogany because it's a nice contrast to the maple. Used some double stick tape and cut around with a knife, and then I use a little trim router and cut up to my knife line, and then I just chisel out the rest so that they'll fit in there. It's pretty simple to do this. You can see there's just a couple cracks from the end, so even though they were all full of epoxy, I wanted to just add the bow ties to keep them from expanding over time, and they're just kind of fun and they look nice. And then I chamfer the edge of the bottom so that they go in nicely, and then I just used a little bit of glue there and tapped them in. And once they were done, I just kind of ground them down with a sander and sanded them out. They look pretty good. So for the legs, I decided to make them out of metal. At the time, I was working at a metal shop, and I stayed after hours to use some of their equipment, which was very nice of them. And I just used 1 by 3 inch steel, if I remember correctly, and I was able to use this big Marvel bandsaw, which was awesome. I welded caps in all the ends. I didn't get a great amount of footage here because it was just in a different facility. I didn't have my tripod or anything, but I went around and welded everything. This used to be my full-time job. I don't do this anymore, but this was kind of what I did for a while, was work at a welding shop. That was my welding table, and I would weld big frames, so I was used to using this equipment, and you know, they were generous enough to let me stay after hours if I was off the clock. I welded up these kind of K patterns, and then I welded this top brace on for the legs, which has a bunch of holes in it, you'll see. So I marked out where the actual legs were going to go, and then I used my router with an edge guide to cut out the recesses. And I would just cut one side and then go over to the other side, and then before I would change the distance on the guide, that way everything was exactly the same. So just cut one side and then the other, and I had to take a couple passes to get to that full 2-inch width of those bottom 1/4-inch steel plates. And I cut a little bit farther past the line, that way there's some room for expansion and contraction. So you can see that pocket goes a little bit farther than the actual piece there. And I hung all this stuff up on my pergola with a little bit of TIG wire just to paint it outside. For these legs, I just went with a black paint, and I'm just starting with some primer here. But boy, they don't look great with the primer, and the black paint really brings them to life. I really like the shape of these. They seem to fit the table really well. I made a template here for the drawers, so I could lay out the hole patterns in the top and on the drawers so they would be exactly the same. So this is just a drill guide. I pretty much just made this out of a piece of 1/8-inch hardboard, and with my holes drilled in it, I could use that to drill the holes into the drawer boxes. It was just to drill a little pilot hole, and then I could follow up with my actual sizes. And same thing, I used that on the desktop itself. And to fasten these drawer boxes, I'm going to use threaded inserts. I use threaded inserts for the legs too. So I had a whole bunch of them to drill. And I always put glue on these. I don't know if it actually makes any difference, but it just gives me a little bit more reassurance that it's going to lock all that wood together where the insert is. I went into my garage and got this bar of aluminum to turn up some little standoffs for the drawers. I didn't want the drawers flush with the top. I just wanted a little reveal just to give it a little more design style. And I'm just using a piece of aluminum for that. So I cut all these little rounds, and I think they were about 1/4 inch. It doesn't really matter what size they were as long as they were all exactly the same. But if I remember correctly, maybe they were 1/2 inch, somewhere in that area. And I would just set the parting tool, and then I would move in the tool by that much, and then I would just part it off. So you can see I have these little pieces, and I painted those black as well. And then, of course, I put my brand on there. And then it was time for finish, and I just went around with a spray lacquer. I like lacquer much better for projects like this, especially going in somebody else's home. I know it's going to hold up better than a hard wax oil or something. Hard wax oils are great for refinishing, but I can't I can't just trust the fact that my customer is going to refinish something at any point. I know lacquer is going to be a nice long-term finish, and it looks really great. So that's what I did here. And I couldn't be happier with the way it looks. Lacquer tends to darken up things like the maple a little bit, but I think it really brings it to life. And then I always wax everything at the end. And man, seeing this with finish, I was really excited with the way it looked. I haven't always been real into the epoxy tables, but I think this came out really well. Going around and spraying the drawer boxes, I did the same thing. I sprayed a couple coats of lacquer on those. And I clear coated the actual legs as well, just for an added layer of protection. And with that done, I can rub out the finish. I just use 220 sandpaper, and I just lightly sand it, and then I use a tack cloth, and then just wax everything after that. And then I can assemble all the pieces. My buddy Eddie was over to help me out, which was really, really great because this piece was getting really heavy. And you can see those little standoffs. They just add a little bit of space in between the drawer and the drawer boxes. And it was kind of tricky to get the pieces in there, but once we got them in there, we were able to bolt everything down. And then we used some bolts on the desk itself too. And like I said, this was really heavy, and it was a bit of a challenge to flip this desk over. And we flipped it over, and then we got the drawers in. And we could take a step back and appreciate the desk for what it was.
Not bad. Very cool.
So here are a couple final pictures the day before it got delivered. And I was really happy with the way this desk came out. And most importantly, so was my customer. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.